Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about morality plays. So, if you remember when I first gave you the overview of medieval drama, I said that there tended to be cycle plays or biblical plays, saints plays, which we're kind of skipping, and morality plays. Frequently, what the moralities and the cycle or biblical plays are the two big categories that people talk about. So, we're going to talk about the morality play form and about some specific examples from England. And then the thing with the morality plays is that they have kind of a long line that comes after them when they are stripped of their religious part of them. They actually influence a lot of drama that comes afterwards. I apologize for the fact that this PowerPoint has a lot of animations in it. So just take a look at this picture before I bring this up. And I don't think you really want to read more on moralities. It's easy to find stuff. So if you look at this, it was called The Summoning of Every Man. It's from a 16th century woodcut, which was a really common, they were really popular in Germany. And so 16th century, that puts it into the 1500s. A lot of the morality plays that we have texts for come from the 1400s. So this would indicate that there's at least a knowledge of this play, of this story for over 100 years or so. Every man, the idea of a morality play has to do with a person, a one figure who stands in for every human being. And that person reckoning with their sins. That is kind of the essence of morality play. So what you've got in this image over here is this guy who's actually identified as every man. And I'm just kind of wondering what these are. These flowers or signs of life, I guess, right here. And he's looking back over his shoulder like, huh? Who, me? That's his gesture, what? And Death's going, yeah, you. And Death is carrying, I don't know, what do you think that looks like? I think it's supposed to represent his book of like the people who he's going to take, I think. It's anyway, Death's like, I've come for you. And that's the basic initiating, inciting action of the play Every Man. So the structure and themes of a morality play. The theme is really man's struggle against sin, man trying to withstand the temptations that life throws at him. And I use him, I guess I should use them, that would be more appropriate. And that there is, that mankind comes up against temptation. It is in our nature that we cannot withstand all temptations. That is sort of what makes us human. That's understood. So therefore, the character who stands in for mankind will fall to temptation of some kind. And then you must have redemption, because these are told from a sort of religious educational standpoint, although moral education standpoint. So this is where we're talking about allegory. So allegory can be used in literary terms to mean a few different things. A lot of times it gets told like something like Animal Farm, but very often that's where people are introduced to allegory in high school. A story is told on two levels. There's a sort of literal level, and then there's a symbolic level of it. We're watching this man try to stay strong against temptation, and he cannot do so. But more than that person, we are watching ourselves do it. And then the other really important part of this, and I mentioned this before, has to do with the personification of abstract ideas. So death, for instance, death, and we are familiar with this. We are familiar with the idea of death being personified. We look at that image, and I don't think we go, "What? Death's not a skeleton." We are familiar with the idea of the Grim Reaper. So that is an allegorical personification of a concept of death. You sometimes in medieval art, but also in others, the soul is personified as a sort of innocent baby. So I want you to hit pause and make some and jot down some thoughts to yourself of where you see that sort of allegorical personification. And the anthropomorphization of animals in Disney movies doesn't count. So where do you see an abstract idea turned into a figure? Hit pause, think about it, jot it down. I want you to share it later in the discussion board. Okay, so in particular, in morality plays, sins and virtues, um, aspects of a human being, are what are personified. So these stories are being told not because they're telling the story of the Bible or a story that is set down already, but that they become about the common man. So when people are watching them, they're watching themselves. Free will is really important because man can only sin and therefore be redeemed if he has the ability to make those choices himself. So that's really a very kind of important concept in there. Um, and in these plays, which are kind of, they exist in a little bit of a vacuum. They don't really, the other things were the other plays that we've looked at were part of these big civic things. These are not. And they seem to be, and then, in fact, there is really specific evidence of them being some of the first sort of traveling troops that are working professionally in the Middle Ages anyway, and asking for payment. So they might be being performed at the hall of the Lord, during a banquet. They are not really attached to a festival or a specific place, although interestingly, most of the English ones we have seem to kind of come from a particular area in the country. The idea of personifying a battle between good and evil is old. It's not something that comes about in the 13 and 1400s. So even way back in the earliest Christian writings, that is evident. And this text, the Psychomachia, is one of the first places where it's seen, and then that is quoted and used throughout medieval lit. So in fact, even the Psychomachia, it's not, the church had not designated 7 deadly sins and virtues yet, but you could kind of see that they're working along that way, that there's 7 evil characteristics, and they are opposed by virtues. So, here's another quiz. I want you to hit pause and see if you can write down the 7 deadly sins. Go, 7 deadly sins. Did you do it? We'll get to them. You have a little bit of clues from what's up here, but these are not necessarily all of the same words. So yeah, wrath, envy, pride, gluttony, sloth, avarice, and lust. I think I just did it. I always get lost in there. And all of them are buffered or fought by a corresponding virtue, many of which are here. So by the time we get to the 1215 Fourth Lateran Council, which instituted annual confession. And by the way, that's also when they started talking about the fact that you need to have take communion once a year. And in order to take communion once a year, you better do confession right before it. So this idea that people would only do a confession once a year to prepare them for probably around Easter for taking communion. In order for people to be able to ask forgiveness for their sins, they need to understand sins. So once that rule was made, the church realizes, oh wait, we have to better educate people. So the personification of these sins and understanding sins and the virtues that go with them became much more part of the church educational framework. In morality plays, the most colorful characters actually, of course, are the sins, but sometimes there are characters that are not one sin. I could be pride, it could be lust, but actually a sin that is maybe a combination, something that actually, frankly, just seems a whole lot more like a person who is a bad influence. And that character, which is referred to as a vice, actually has a really long history going in further into drama, into the Renaissance, and much further, especially if anytime you see a character who's just like a bad guy and they don't seem to be, we don't understand what their motivation or causes are for being a bad guy. Modern acting would tell you that if you are playing that bad guy, you better figure out what your motivations are, but the play or the script might not tell you. And so somebody like Iago in Othello, every bad guy in movies, like what's their motivation? Sometimes they tell us and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they might tell us what it is and we think, well, that's kind of feeble. Really, if you want to destroy the world, bad guys in James Bond movies, how well motivated are they? So that vice figure is important going forward. So I kind of really apologize. I'm in the midst of really rethinking my content here. And I'm like, why is this so England heavy? Well, alas, it is. I'm going to try and fix it. So there is one manuscript that comes from England in the 15th century, and it's called the Macro manuscript. It's named for the man who owned the manuscript, whose last name was Macro. So there's that. That's why it's called it. And this manuscript has these three plays: the Castle of Perseverance, Mankind, and Wisdom, who is Christ. And they are collected together. It's like it's an anthology of morality plays. If we didn't have this manuscript, we would have some excerpts from some of these plays. I think Wisdom is found in another manuscript, but without the survival of this manuscript, we don't have these plays, which is just always sort of an interesting thing to think about. They are not all written by the same person. They're really quite different from each other, but they all share the basic format and themes of a morality play. The Castle of Perseverance is very, very, very long. It probably would take 3.5 hours or more to perform. And it has all 7 deadly sins. It's got a very large cast. It's just sort of like a big monstrous production. And in fact, the cycle of man being tempted and falling and tempted and falling happens twice in the whole play. And then there's eventually this sort of debate from what is called the 4 daughters of God, which are justice, mercy, righteousness, and maybe charity. I forgot who the other one is. Mercy, justice, mercy, righteousness, and I don't know. And they debate about whether or not it's enough for mankind to be sorry. And you can see how justice and righteousness would be like, no, he needs to be punished. Why should he be saved? And then the other side is like, because he said he's sorry. Mercy wins and the soul is saved. All right, so it's really long. I wonder if you can hear the vacuum upstairs. Okay, so the next one, which is Mankind, and that's the one that I want you to read, is shorter. It's probably about 40 minutes maybe to perform. It's much more raucous and bawdy and funny, and it features these three vices who are not named after seven deadly sins. They're these amalgams of sins. And mischief is a whole sort of series of characters who are there to tempt Mankind, who's a good little farmer trying to farm, and to tempt him into going and having fun. That's sort of the premise for Mankind. And then Wisdom, who is Christ, is really totally different also. It is much more formal, much more pageant or mask-like. It is, there's not very many laughs in it. It's a little, I don't really want to say stiff, but it's the kind of performance you could imagine happening in a well-to-do hall where ladies were present, whereas Mankind seems a little more, I don't know, earthy. And the kind of central conceit for Wisdom is that the main character is the soul, is anima, who is female, and she marries Wisdom, who is a personification or avatar for Christ. And that you can just like hear how these are different from each other. Um, then the last one, which is the one that most people have heard of and may have been forced to read at some point, is Every Man. And Every Man, which we saw this picture of earlier, is there's an English text of it, but actually it's a translation, it seems, from a Dutch play, Elke, which means every man. So that framework, is that death comes and says, hey, dude, your time is up. You better get your books in order. And there's a lot of accounting metaphors. Like, you better make sure that your pluses are more than your minuses in terms of the good things you've done and the bad things you've done. And Every Man goes around and asks for help from his kin, from his family, and from his friends. And they're like, we're staying on, we're not dying. You're on your own. And his goods won't help him. He cannot take the goods that he has made with him, like the money he has made. And eventually the only aspect of him that he can take to the grave are his good deeds. Good deeds cannot go with him into the grave, but she can accompany him. And they are gendered. And I think it's interesting to think about how personifications are gendered, but they are. In the Castle of Perseverance, not surprisingly, lust or lechery is personified as female. The rest of them are personified male. Every Man is kind of a bit of a relief to have good deeds be personified as a woman, since she's the most helpful to mankind. I'm showing you this image quickly, and I'm going to move beyond it because this is a possible topic for a research project, or not a report on getting more information. The front of the script of the Castle of Perseverance has this illustration of how the show is to be staged. And believe it or not, it is possible to read these words. And it shows what's probably a ditch in a circle around a field with some sort of scaffold that represents a castle in the center. And then also scaffolds on what appears to be the other side of the ditch. So if you look at this picture and you see it as an overhead, that seems to be who wrote this? Is it the playwright? Is it, we don't know, but a suggestion of how the show is envisioned to be played. And it does, by the way, call for fireworks to come out of the devil's rear end. So there's some indication of pyrotechnics. There's also indication that it's possible that the ditch might have been a way of keeping people, like crowd control management, and keeping people who haven't paid out, maybe. I will leave that, I will give you that basic thing, and hopefully somebody will look more into it. This is a translation, and I'm not showing it to you because hopefully somebody will look at it. But this is a translation of what the text is that's on there. And if nobody decides to work on Castle of Perseverance, I'll come back to it for you. So, okay, so that's sort of the morality genre. There are moralities throughout Europe. I think that these genres that I've talked about of biblical saints and morality, I'm growing increasingly uncomfortable with the generic rules, because I don't personally believe anybody sits down to say, I'm going to write a morality play or I'm going to write a saints play. They sit down to write something, and it tends to fall into particular genres. But if you start to look across Europe and across all kinds of plays, those hard and fast lines between genres don't really hold up. And a lot of times a saints play is a morality play. If a saint was a naughty boy and then had a conversion experience, that's a tale of somebody being tempted into sin and then repenting. So yeah, so you can't take them with a grain of salt. There are other performances, other types of performances, and they are a little harder to talk about in detail because of text. Like, they're not the playlets, the texts for some of these things are fewer of them survive. More of them survive in the Renaissance period, or in the period just going into that. But we know that it was common for people who are having a party or a banquet to have entertainment. And although there might not be a text that tells us what was performed in detail, we have bank accounts of, somebody keeps a record, and it might say this much money paid to the players for, and there might be a title of what they were performing in between courses at a banquet. So if you've ever been to a fundraiser or to a wedding or to anything where there's multiple courses in a meal, that there frequently is, maybe it's the band plays a song between the courses, or somebody makes a speech between the courses of the meal. That's the kind of environment where you might see the playing of a story from classical myth, or something with music and some dancing. Masks, very often called masks or balls, in the Renaissance became huge things. And they were political, they were demonstrations of wealth, all of that kind of thing. So an interlude is usually defined as a short play that's performed between the courses of a banquet. A farce might be a longer play that's, it's really, farce isn't a very good word there. I would call that more of a satire from our standpoint. We think of farce as like bedroom farce with doors slamming and that kind of thing. But for them, it's a little bit more of a poking fun at certain types of people. So that's an entire sort of very courtly, rich people form of entertainment. I don't mean that the people performing were rich. I mean, they were going to the rich people to perform. And I really do think that, when we opened the Jimmy Center or whatever, the Wilkins Center, and there was this big old hoopla, and we had, various performances from the conservatory there. And we say to ourselves, why is the conservatory the ones that are, or the holiday gala, why are we the ones that are giving this entertainment? It's because the university or the Duke or whoever is putting it on is saying, look at what I have. Look at what we have. Look at what I can afford to create for you. there is a sort of weird value to the arts and to performance that is associated with people in power. I can afford to give you this. I can I can sponsor an art exhibition. I can sponsor this. It's the reason why sports arenas are all renamed and now are named after the sponsor, the Staples Center, or whatever, the Verizon Center, whatever the big sponsor is saying, look, I have enough extra money to sponsor this. So there's the arts have long had to rely on that sort of sponsorship. So as in the early 1500s, this is when, Luther's Protestant revolution comes about, and the Catholic Church is split, basically. And you have some people moving in the direction of Lutheranism, and ultimately in England, towards the Church of England. Europe becomes less universally Catholic. So the use of overtly religious material on stage becomes highly problematic. And eventually plays become more secular. God is not going to be mentioned. We're not going to deal with Jesus. We're not going to deal with the personification of sins. But so many of the forms and types of characters and like the structure of a plot stay. So something like, ultimately something like Dr. Faustus by Marlowe is really, he's a person and he wants more knowledge, and he makes a deal with the devil to get more knowledge. Ultimately, he does not repent because he thinks there's no way that he could be forgiven. And he goes to hell. So there's still hell and devil, but it's not overtly it's just Christian. It's not overtly Catholic or anything. There are a lot of those types of morality plays. Faustus is the big well-known one, but there's a lot in between where the moral life can be examined sort of separate from religion. Which brings me to something very contemporary. This country is sort of founded upon one of its principles is the separation of church and state. When I was in college, I took an ethics in society class, and we were confronted with this question of if a country does not have a shared religion, how do the people in the country have a shared moral foundation? And I just want to throw that question out to you because it seems to me a super, super relevant question right now. We cannot all agree that we don't have a shared religion in this country, although the Judeo-Christian tradition is the strongest one in this country, especially as far as its founding is involved. We cannot expect everybody to follow the same God or to even follow a God, right? So what do we base our value system on? How can we expect certain morals and values from each other if for the most part, morals and values are tied to religion? I'm just going to leave you with that question because I think it's worth thinking about. So, feedback on your 7 deadly sins in the discussion board. Feedback on whether or not you could think of contemporary versions of personification of abstract ideas. And if you want to muse on that moral question, I invite you to, and I'll think a little bit more and put in the discussion board whether there's a couple other prompts you might want to talk about. Thanks.